Welcome back to another lightsaber build. This time I'm going to be making my second Mace Windu Lightsaber, the MW3 by Korbanth. First off, I wanted to say that this isn't actually a customer commission, but rather I'm going to be selling it later, which means I can build this however I'd like. So now let's just get right into it. Here are the parts I'm using. First off is the same chassis that I designed for the previous Mace Windu Lightsaber. Then we have a 24mm bass speaker from Smuggler's Outpost, along with an 18650 lithium-ion battery, a positive battery tab, and a negative battery tab. Next up, we have the two additional features I added, the OLED display and the Bluetooth module. The last part I have on hand to show you is this NeoPixel connector. The two parts I'm currently missing are the buttons and the CFX soundboard. Those will be here by the time we get to them, so let's just get started with the speaker. Here's a few helpful tips on the speaker for you guys if you want to do it yourself. The first is that you want to pre-tin the pads before soldering the wire on, it just makes it a little easier. The second thing is that I like to use 28 gauge wire, although you could also use 30 gauge wire if you want. The last thing is that it doesn't matter which side is positive and negative, as long as they're separate. And now I'm just going to feed the wires through the chassis and snap the speaker in place. I'm going to come back to this later with some E6000 and secure it in place better, but only after I make sure everything works first. Now I'm going to move on to the battery compartment, more specifically, the battery tabs. First I'm going to cut these off so it fits in my chassis design. Next I'm going to set up the negative contact to put in the chassis first, although it really doesn't matter what order you put it in. I will mention that for the positive contact, I actually fed the positive wire through the channel first before soldering it to the tab. That's because I designed this part of the chassis a bit poorly, so it's just easier this way. Now we have both positive and negative battery contacts each set up with 22 gauge wires, which means we now have most of the bottom section complete. To finish off the rest of this section, we're going to move on to the first extra feature, the OLED display. Just like what I did with the speaker, I'm going to pre-tin the pads to make it easier to solder on the wires. For those of you who are trying to add this to your own lightsaber, I'm using either 28 or 30 gauge wires. The OLED display fits really well in the chassis as it is, just snaps right in place, but I'll be coming back with some E6000 to make it more secure. So now that we have installed all the parts in the bottom of the chassis, we can move on to the top of the lightsaber with the NeoPixel connector. As you can see, these pins are already soldered in place. I don't remember exactly why, but I did it sometime in the past, so we don't have to do it this time. If you notice here, I'm adding a blade detection wire and two data lines. I just think that they're really cool features to have in a lightsaber. I'll try to show them off to you guys once I'm done with the install. There we go. Now the NeoPixel is all set up in the chassis. Now that we have most of the main features installed, we can move on to another extra feature, a Bluetooth module. There's not much for me to say about installing a Bluetooth module, except just reference the wiring diagram. For now, I'm just going to place the Bluetooth module off to the side, and we're going to move on to installing the buttons. Like with most of the other parts I've shown, I like to use 28 or 30 gauge wire. Okay, here I am using some super glue to glue these buttons down. I don't know if I'd really recommend doing this because I've had some issues where the glue seeps into the button and breaks it, but I found that when I use E6000, the buttons actually prevent me from sliding the chassis into the hilt. But now that we have everything else installed, we can move on to the final part, the soundboard. I chose to use a CFX soundboard like I do with all my favorite lightsabers, and this one is installed with a magnetic sensor which will allow me to have force activation. Ultimately, there's not really a big difference in functionality between CFX soundboards and Profi soundboards, so I tend to go with CFX because it's a lot more user-friendly. And with that, the lightsaber is complete, after a little bit of work on the computer to set up the SD card, of course. So let's put in a battery and see if it all works. The speaker seems to be working, and the OLED display as well. And while I'm cycling through the different animations of the OLED display, I'm using the auxiliary button, so that clearly works. I think next I want to see if the force activation is going to work, so I'm going to scroll back to the Metachlorian scanner just for fun. Force activation works perfectly. Looks like everything works. Time to put it in the hilt. What's interesting about this lightsaber is that the top of the emitter and the blade plug are actually built in one piece, so you have to replace it with a blade retention emitter in order to put the blade in. And now it's time to test the blade detection and to see if the blade will actually light up. Looks like I did everything right. The very last thing left to do is to test out the Bluetooth, and I'll do that by showing off the fonts and blade colors. And that brings us to the end. Thank you all for watching this build. I hope you enjoyed and maybe you learned something from it. I also want to let you guys know that I have a bunch more content coming up and not just lightsaber stuff, so look forward to all of that.